14 assistants in 11 months. Some lasted 3 days. One lasted 40 minutes before she threw a legal brief at the wall and told him to get out. The staffing agencies had stopped returning calls, and on a Tuesday morning in October, a single father with a 7-year-old at home and $11 left in his checking account rode the elevator to the 42nd floor of Ashworth Tower, not because he believed he could survive her, but because he had exactly no other choice. What happened in the months that followed will stay with you. If this story already has you, tap like and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far it travels. Owen Callard stood in the elevator and watched the floor numbers climb and told himself this was just a job. He had said that before. He had said it driving security patrols in Kandahar when the radio chatter went quiet in the wrong way. And he had said it managing supply chains in the Texas heat when the contractor 2 trucks ahead of him drove over something that changed the shape of the convoy. And he had said it in a Denver hospital corridor while a doctor with kind eyes told him that his wife Marisol had not made it through surgery following the accident on the Cherry Creek bike path. Just a job. Get through it. Come home to Piper. The elevator opened onto a reception area that had the specific chill of rooms designed to communicate power before a single word was spoken. Gray stone floors. A desk occupied by a woman named Gretchen who had the expression of someone waiting for him to fail. On the wall behind her, the Ashworth Optics Group logo, a stylized lens with a single ray of light bending through it in brushed bronze. Owen had done his research the night before, sitting at his kitchen table after Piper was asleep. He had looked up Nora Ashworth the way he had once looked up terrain before a mission, not for reassurance, but for information he could use. Nora Ashworth had founded Ashworth Optics Group at 31, building it from a precision lens prototype lab into a manufacturer supplying optics to defense contractors, medical device companies, and 4 of the largest telescope arrays in the Western Hemisphere. She had done it without inherited money, without a famous name, without anything but a doctorate in optical engineering, and a particular quality that the Forbes profile described as relentless clarity. By 36, she was running a company worth $240 million. Then, 14 months ago, she had woken up on a Thursday morning and the world had gone wrong in the center of her vision. A pale fog, as she apparently described it to her doctors, like breathing on glass. The diagnosis came 3 weeks later, a rare and progressive condition affecting the optic nerve, accelerated in her case by the altitude and the dry Denver air she had breathed for 38 years, though altitude was not the cause, only one factor among several that had conspired. Within 6 months, she had lost functional vision in both eyes. Not total darkness, she could still distinguish light from shadow, still track movement in bright conditions, but functional blindness, the kind that ended most people's careers and was supposed to end hers. It had not ended hers. Or rather, she was in the process of refusing to let it, which was apparently making her extremely difficult to work for. He had also found the shorter articles, the quiet mentions in the business press of assistants departing without comment. The one blind item in a local business column about a CEO whose company was hemorrhaging staff. The note from the staffing consultant who had finally, on her 4th phone call, explained the situation to him in language that left nothing to interpretation. "She's brilliant," the consultant had said, in a voice that contained both admiration and something like defeat. "And she's in pain, and she is taking it out on everyone within range." Owen had taken the job for $11 and a daughter who needed school shoes. He had stayed for reasons that came later. Gretchen led him down a corridor lined with framed photographs of telescopes and medical instruments and precisely machined glass elements, things the company had helped build. Owen noted without comment that the photographs were hung at a uniform height, that the corridor was clear of any objects that would cross the walking path, that the entire floor had been reconfigured for someone navigating it without sight. Not the work of the most recent adaptations. This had been done deliberately over time by someone who expected to be here for a long time. The office itself was a corner room with floor-to-ceiling windows on 2 sides. The Denver skyline spread out to the east, and the foothills of the Rockies rose pale and sharp in the October light to the west. The light came in at an angle that fell directly across the desk. Nora Ashworth sat behind the desk with her hands flat on its surface, and her face turned slightly toward the window, toward the light. She was not looking out, she could not look out, not in any functional sense, but she was turned toward it the way plants turn toward the sun. An unconscious orientation. He noted it and stored it. She was 38. Her dark hair was pulled back with the efficiency of someone who had stopped making it complicated. Her posture was exact, the kind that came from training yourself to project authority through bearing when you could no longer do it through eye contact. Her face had sharp angles and a stillness that was not peace but containment, the expression of someone managing a great deal without letting any of it show on the surface. On her desk, to the right of the keyboard where her hand rested naturally, sat a small brass compass. Old, compact, the lid worn smooth from handling. She said before he had crossed the room to her desk, "You're not from a staffing agency." He was not. He had been referred by a former Army logistics officer who had worked with Nora's head of procurement and had suggested Owen when the procurement officer, in a moment of frankness, mentioned the assistant situation. Owen had called directly. He said, "No, I reached out through your procurement office, Owen Callard." She said, "I know who you are, I had you researched." "Sit down." He sat. She said, "Military background, logistics. You ran supply chains in active deployment zones and then transitioned into civilian contractor work. You have a daughter. Your wife died 3 years ago." He said, "That's right." She said, "You've never done executive assistant work." He said, "I've never had a boss who communicated in writing before." There was a silence. He watched her face and saw something move through it, something that was not quite amusement but lived in the same general territory. She said, "The position pays well because it is difficult. I will tell you once what is expected, and I will not explain my reasoning unless I decide it is useful for you to understand it. I work from 6 in the morning until 9 at night on most days. I require my workspace maintained in precise arrangement because I navigate by memory, and any disruption to the arrangement disrupts my ability to function. I require all correspondence summarized in a specific format delivered verbally twice daily. I require my calendar managed across 2 time zones. I require my medical schedule handled with complete discretion. I require someone who can be reached at any hour and who does not make my disability the most interesting thing about themselves when they are around me." Owen said, "Understood." She said, "The 14 people before you found the conditions unworkable." Owen said, "I've worked in conditions where the consequence of failure was not inconvenience." Another silence. Longer. She said, "You may start now." He had not been told he was hired. He understood that this was the hiring. The first thing he did was spend 20 minutes learning the exact arrangement of her desk. Not by touching, he asked her to walk him through it verbally, object by object, and she did so with the precise economy of someone who had mapped this space in her mind so many times it had become architecture. He made notes. He confirmed each object's position by asking her to verify. When he was done, she said, "Most people just move things and assume I'll adapt." He said, "That seems inefficient." She turned her face toward him the way she had turned toward the window, not looking, orienting. She said, "Yes, it is." The first week was difficult in the specific way that difficult things were difficult when they were also clarifying. Not because they were ambiguous, because they were completely clear and the clarity cost something. The first morning began with a mistake he had not made and was held accountable for anyway. He had been at his desk for 40 minutes when Nora called across the office. Not loudly, she did not raise her voice. She carried it at a level that assumed he was paying attention, and said she needed the Hartfield acquisition summary in her inbox in the correct format. He pulled up the shared drive she had given him access to and searched. He searched by every variation of the spelling he could think of. He searched by date range. He searched by file type. He found nothing. He said, "I'm not finding it under that name. Could it be filed under a different term?" She said, "It's in the system. Search more carefully." He searched for 8 more minutes. He was thorough. He was certain it was not where she said it was. He said so without softening it because softening it would have cost them both time. He said, I've searched every variation I can construct. Either it's filed under a name I don't know, or it's not in the locations I have access to. If you tell me where else to look, I'll find it immediately. The silence that followed had weight. She said, try the Morrison subfolder. The Hartfield matter was associated with the client who referred them. He found it in 45 seconds. He printed it and placed it on her desk without comment. She took it without turning her face toward him. There was no thank you. He had not expected one. He was already building a map of what acknowledgement looked like from her, and he understood it was not going to look like what it looked like from most people. What it looked like was, she moved on to the next task without escalating. That was the acknowledgement. You had done the thing and she was done with it. By noon of the first day, he had handled 4 phone calls she had declined to take, summarized them in the format she had specified, rescheduled 2 calendar conflicts, handled a delivery at the side entrance, and been told that his font in the summary document was wrong 11 point. She used 12 that he had been breathing too loudly near her workspace, and that his phone greeting was not the format she used, which she had not told him. He fixed the font. He moved his chair back 2 feet. He asked without comment what the correct greeting was. She told him like he should have already known. He said, got it, and used it correctly for every call after. He ate lunch standing at the small kitchen counter adjacent to the office. He ate it in 4 minutes because he knew the afternoon would require the same sustained attention as the morning and he wanted to be ready for it. Mrs. Gretchen, the front desk staff member, passed him in the hallway while he was rinsing his cup. She looked at him with the expression of someone who had expected to be packing his things for him by now. She said, you're still here. He said, I'll be back tomorrow. She said, the last one left at noon. The one before at 10. She seemed to be accumulating this data for purposes she had not yet disclosed. He said, I'll be here at 7:15 tomorrow. The afternoon was harder than the morning. At 1:30 she gave him a research task, and at 2 she asked him to rework the entire afternoon calendar, because a call with the Chicago legal team had been moved, which created a chain reaction through 4 other commitments that required 7 emails in careful sequence and 2 phone calls, tracked as a logistics problem, which it was. He mapped the dependencies first and worked backward from the constraints. He had the analysis on her desk at 3:58. He had the calendar restructured by 3:30. She read the analysis and said, the Alderman Street property is missing the zoning variance filing. He said, I'll have it in 30 minutes. He had it in 22. She said nothing further about the analysis. He understood that this also meant it was acceptable. He sat in his truck in the parking structure for 3 minutes before driving home, not because he needed to think about anything specific. Because he had been operating at full capacity since 6 in the morning and the 3 minutes were necessary. The same decompression he had learned to take in the field when the day's work was done, and the body hadn't caught up yet. He picked up Piper from his mother's house. She was at the kitchen table with a library book, the specific stillness of a child waiting without saying she was waiting. When he came through the door, her face changed entirely, the pure involuntary relief of reunion with the person she trusted most. She said, how was it? He said, interesting. She said, did she fire you? He said, no. She considered this seriously for a moment, then picked up her book again. The second week settled into a rhythm that was not comfortable but was navigable, the way rough terrain was navigable when you had mapped it. He learned that she worked best between 9 and noon. The physical therapy sessions with Dr. Alina Marsh at 10 were followed by 2 hours of focused, controlled energy, during which Nora moved through decisions at a pace her executive team found difficult to track. Owen front-loaded the complex items into those windows without telling her why, and the days ran more smoothly for it. He learned that she had a specific relationship with sound. Because she was navigating primarily by hearing, she was acutely sensitive to the acoustic texture of a room. A call with unusual background noise told her something was wrong at the location. A hesitation before a number told her the person was not confident in it. She could hear a misstatement in the pause pattern of a conference line, the way a sighted person might read it in a face. He learned to be quiet in a particular way, present without creating ambient noise. On Wednesday of the second week, a call came in from Renfield, the same Renfield whose name was on the Compass story, and Owen heard something in the quality of her voice afterward that he catalogued under things not yet resolved. She was not upset. She was more controlled than usual. The kind of control applied when you had felt something and needed to contain it. He filed it. On Thursday, a legal letter arrived in the physical mail. When he read the sender's firm aloud at her instruction, her hands went flat on the desk. She said, "Open it and read me the first paragraph." The letter concerned a supplier licensing dispute, nothing urgent. But the name of the opposing counsel's firm was one he had already seen in the board communications, and the accumulation of small signals pointing in the same direction was beginning to resolve into a shape. By the end of the third week, something had shifted in the texture of the room. Gradually, the way weather shifts, not in a single moment but in the accumulated weight of days, she still corrected him. She would correct him as long as he worked for her, but the corrections had changed shape. In the first days they had been blunt, as if she expected him to interpret them as signals to leave and was checking whether he would. Now they were targeted, the kind that assumed he was going to use them rather than be driven off by them. He had learned to hear the difference. One afternoon in the third week, he came back from a lunch errand to find her in the middle of a call that was going badly. He could tell from the hallway by the quality of her voice, the flat, careful tone she used when she was angry and performing composure. He set down the items and went to his desk and kept his focus there, leaving her the space the call required. When it ended, she said, without preamble, "My lead developer is threatening to leave. Someone made him an offer and he's using it as leverage." Owen said, "Is the offer real or is he using it to negotiate?" She said, "Does it matter?" He said, "Yes. If it's real, you're deciding what he's worth against what it costs to replace him and lose the transition time. If it's a tactic, you're deciding how much to give him and what precedent it sets." She turned toward him with the listening turn he had learned to distinguish from the orienting turn. She said, "What makes you think those are different calculations?" He said, "Because in the first case, if you don't meet the number, you lose him. In the second, if you meet it too easily, you've told everyone else on the team what the floor is for similar leverage. The solution is different in each case." She said, "He's real enough that I have to assume he'd actually leave." Owen said, "Then give him what he wants, but make him feel like you went to the wall for it. Make him feel like it cost you something to find the number and like he's earned it specifically, not like you gave it because you were afraid of him walking. If he stays because he feels valued, he stays differently than if he stays because you capitulated." She looked toward the window for a moment. She said, "The last several people in this role would have told me what to do. You give me the architecture and let me choose." He said, "The architecture is my job. The choice is yours." She made the call. 38 minutes later, she returned to her desk and said to the room generally, "He's staying." Owen said, "Good." She said, "How did you know the distinction mattered?" He said, "I spent 3 years managing people who were paid to be somewhere dangerous. A man who feels like he chose to be there works differently from a man who feels like he has no other option." She was quiet. Then she said, "That's true of more than dangerous work." He said, "Yes." She picked up the compass and held it for a moment, not opening it, just holding it, the way she held it when she was working something out, then set it back down and returned to her work. The days accumulated. He learned the rhythm of her medical schedule. Marsh twice a week, a specialist at the Denver Center for Neurological Research on Tuesday mornings, the latter not on the official calendar, known to him only because he managed her driver and the driver's logs were complete. He did not ask about the Tuesday appointments. He noted them and let them sit in the category of things she had not chosen to explain. He also noticed the other thing he had been noticing since the first week, the way she turned toward light sources not just to orient by them, but in a different quality, the way you turned toward a sound you weren't certain you had heard. On the afternoons when the low October sun came through the west window directly onto her face, she would go very still for a moment, face lifted, holding the stillness with the particular attention of someone trying to determine whether something was real. He did not mention this either. He was in the business of noticing without requiring that everything he noticed be addressed. Some things needed time before they were ready to be words. Nora Ashworth was not cruel in the way the staffing consultant had implied. She was demanding in the way of someone who had built something significant and was trying to hold it together with reduced capacity and would not pretend otherwise. Her standards were not punishments. They were the minimum threshold required to keep a $240 million company running when its CEO could not read a document without a screen reader, could not make eye contact across a boardroom table, could not walk into an investor meeting, and project the visual authority that the markets apparently required. She was demanding in the way of someone who had built something significant and was trying to hold it together with reduced capacity and would not pretend otherwise. Her standards were not punishments. They were the minimum threshold required to keep a $240 million company running when its CEO could not read a document without a screen reader, could not make eye contact across a boardroom table, could not walk into an investor meeting, and project the visual authority that the markets apparently required. She had compensated by developing other kinds of precision. Her memory for details she had been read aloud was exact and unforgiving. Her ability to hear what was not being said in a phone call, the pause before a number, the slight elevation in a lawyer's voice, was more acute than most sighted executives' ability to read a room. She knew what was in every file on her system and could navigate to it faster by voice command than most people could by search. What she could not do was run her company the way she had run it before, and she had not yet found the configuration that let her run it differently well enough to satisfy herself. And that gap, between the self she remembered and the self she currently inhabited, was the source of everything the staffing consultant had described as difficult. Owen understood this by the end of day 3. He did not tell her he understood it. He simply adjusted his work to close parts of the gap without requiring her to acknowledge that the gap existed. He changed the format of his morning briefing, not by asking permission but by trying it, a verbal summary structured so that the most urgent items came first, with decision points flagged explicitly so she did not have to filter for them, and supporting detail available on request rather than front-loaded. She said nothing about the change the first day. The second day she said, "The briefing format is better," and moved on. He learned that she worked best in the late morning between 9 and noon, and that the period immediately after her physical therapy sessions, which a specialist named Dr. Alina Marsh conducted twice a week, was the period she was sharpest in a particular way, a quality of concentrated energy that he identified on day 4 and confirmed on day 6. He front-loaded the complex decisions into that window without telling her that he had noticed the pattern. He also noticed something that he filed under things not yet understood. On the afternoons when Dr. Marsh came, and on several mornings when the light from the west window fell directly onto Nora's face, she would turn toward it and hold very still for a moment in a way that was different from her usual orientation to light. Less a habit and more a response. The way you turned toward a sound you weren't sure you had heard. He did not mention it. The brass compass on her desk he learned about at the end of the first week. He had moved it, carefully, by 2 centimeters to adjust its position before placing a document beside it, and when she reached for it during a phone call and her hand found empty space, she had stopped mid-sentence and gone very still. He had placed the compass back immediately and quietly. She had found it, completed the call, and said afterward without accusation, "The compass does not move." He said, "Understood." She said, "It was given to me by the man who first funded this company, Arthur Renfield. He told me it was for when I lost my direction. He said good compasses pointed north regardless of where you stood." Owen said, "Where do you keep it when you leave the office?" She said, "I keep it here." He said, "I'll make sure it's in the same place every morning before you arrive." She turned toward him, that small, particular orientation. She said, "Who researched you?" He said, "The same people who research everyone in your orbit, I assume." She said, "You have good instincts for proximity. Most people either hover or keep too much distance when they're uncertain what I can perceive. You stay at a consistent distance and you move predictably." He said, I spent years in environments where unpredictable movement had consequences. She said, yes, I read about that. She paused. What happened to your wife? He said she was killed in a cycling accident. A driver ran a stop sign. She said you weren't with her. He said I was supposed to be. We were going to ride together that morning. I had a contractor call that ran long. She did not offer condolences. He found he appreciated this. Everyone offered condolences. It had become a sound rather than a meaning. She said, how old is your daughter? He said, 7. She said, what is her name? He said, Piper. She turned back toward the window. Outside, the foothills were going amber in the October afternoon. She said, I need the Hartfield acquisition summary on the shared drive by 4. Use the format from the last filing. He said, it'll be there at 3:30. It was. The second week brought two things Owen had been expecting and one he had not. The expected things were the operational complexity, a legal matter in the Hartfield acquisition that required coordinating 3 attorneys across 2 time zones, and a supplier dispute that required Nora to take 3 calls in a single afternoon while Owen tracked the thread of each conversation and prepared summary notes without being asked. The unexpected thing was Arthur Renfield. Renfield was 62, the founding board chair of Ashworth Optics Group. He was the man who had given Nora the compass. He had known her since she was a doctoral student, had believed in her before anyone else had, and had sat in the boardroom for 7 years watching her build something that justified every dollar he had placed on that early bet. He was also, Owen understood within the first 20 minutes of meeting him, conducting a very careful assessment of Nora's capacity to continue running her company. Renfield came to the office on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced, which Nora apparently had not allowed any visitor to do for 11 months and had allowed him without hesitation. Owen had been at his desk when Renfield arrived. He had watched the older man move through the office with the ease of someone who had moved through it many times, sit across from Nora, and speak to her with the warmth of genuine affection, and underneath it, a quality that Owen identified as grief. Not the grief of recent loss. The grief of something being lost slowly in front of you and not knowing how to stop it. After the visit, Nora was quiet for the rest of the afternoon. Owen said nothing about it, but he noted it and filed it alongside the other things he was filing. The way the rest of the executive team walked carefully around her authority rather than engaging with it directly. The way the board materials had a particular quality of being managed, filtered, pre-summarized, that struck him as simultaneously protective and limiting. The way the Hartfield acquisition, which by every measure was the strategic opportunity of Ashworth Optics Group's history, was proceeding with a slowness that did not match the urgency the financial details implied. He built a picture of the environment the way he had once built pictures of terrain, not by asking questions directly, but by listening to what the landscape offered when you paid attention. By the end of the second week, he had the picture. The company was being carefully managed toward a transition of authority that no one had said out loud yet, and the person most responsible for that management was the man who had given Nora her compass and still visited her with the warmth of genuine care. Owen kept this to himself. It was not yet his problem to solve. He was a week into the second month when the first thing that was unambiguously his came from outside the professional register. It was a Wednesday, and Piper had a school closure, a water main issue on the building's block, and Owen's neighbor who sometimes covered these situations was at a family event in Boulder. He had called ahead and told Gretchen he might need to bring his daughter in for the afternoon. Gretchen had told him that would not be acceptable. He had called Nora directly. He had said, I need to tell you about a situation. She had said, tell me. He had told her. He had added, if this makes the position untenable, I understand that. She had said, how old did you say she was? He had said, 7. Nora had been quiet for a moment. She had said, bring her. She stays in the assistant area and does not come into my office uninvited. He had said, understood. Piper had come in wearing the serious expression she wore when she had been given rules and was deciding how to interpret their boundaries. She had set her backpack on Owen's desk, taken out her sketchbook, and begun drawing with the focused quiet of a child who was genuinely absorbed, not performing absorption. For 2 hours, everything was normal. Then Piper put down her pencil, looked at the closed door to Nora's office and said, "Can I take her a picture I made?" Owen said, "She asked you to stay out here." Piper said, "I'm not staying out there forever." He said, "Piper. She said I drew the mountains. She can't see them from in there. I want to tell her what they look like." Owen sat with that for a moment. He thought about telling Piper that Ms. Ashworth did not need a 7-year-old to describe the mountains to her. He thought about the weight of what his daughter had just said without knowing she was saying anything significant. He said, "I'll ask her." He went to the door and knocked. He said, "My daughter made a drawing and would like to bring it to you. I can tell her no." There was a silence that lasted longer than necessary. Nora said, "She can bring it." Piper went in. Owen stood in the doorway and watched. Piper crossed the office with the directness of a child who had decided to do something and was doing it. She stopped at the right distance from the desk, not too close, and she said, in the matter-of-fact voice she used when she was communicating information she considered important, "I drew the mountains. They're orange right now because the light is going sideways. I thought you might want to know." Nora had been sitting with her hands on the desk. She had turned toward the window when she heard Piper's voice. She said, "Where are the mountains from here?" Piper said, "Behind your left shoulder. The big ones. The ones that look like someone folded them." Nora turned her head fractionally toward the left. She said, "What else is in the drawing?" Piper said, "Your building. It's taller than the ones next to it, and some clouds that aren't doing much. And I put a star at the top even though you can't see stars in the daytime because I thought the drawing needed one." Nora said, "Why did it need one?" Piper said, "Because things that are hard to see are still there." Owen, in the doorway, did not say anything. He could not have spoken clearly even if he had wanted to. Nora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a true thing." Piper said, "You can keep the drawing if you want. I make a lot of them." She set it on the edge of the desk carefully, just at the edge where Nora's hand would naturally reach, and walked back to Owen in the doorway. She said in an entirely ordinary voice, "Can I have the granola bar from your bag?" He said, "Yes." She went back to the assistant area. Owen looked at the drawing on the edge of Nora's desk. She had not touched it yet, but she knew it was there. He went back to his work. At 5 o'clock, when Owen was preparing the end-of-day briefing, Nora said without preamble, "Your daughter said the right thing about the star." Owen said, "She doesn't know she said a right thing. She just said what she thought." Nora said that's why it was right. She did not say anything else about it. But that evening, after she had dismissed him, he passed her office on his way to the elevator, and the drawing was not on the edge of the desk. It was on the windowsill, propped against the glass, angled toward the light. He did not mention this the next morning. The third month brought the external threat Owen had known was coming and had been unable to accelerate. In the weeks before it arrived, there had been the night in her office, the mountains in the dark, the conversation that had been a different kind of conversation than either of them had had before. He had replayed it in the way he replayed significant things, not obsessively but with the care of someone trying to understand what had changed and what it would mean in the days that followed. What it meant, practically, was that they both worked with slightly more candor about the things that were not strictly professional. Not much. Nora was not a person given to candor in excess of what she had decided was necessary. But there was a difference, measurable in the fraction of time before she answered a question, in the occasional margin note she left on a briefing document that acknowledged the quality of the analysis rather than only noting its corrections. He understood this for what it was, trust extended in the smallest denominator she could manage. He treated it accordingly, which meant not naming it, not building on it faster than she offered it, not pretending it was larger than it was. He was learning, in those weeks, the specific work of being trusted by someone who had been systematically disappointed by trust. It required a kind of patience that was not passive. He was not waiting for her to become easier to know, but active. The patience of someone who understood that walls built over time came down over time, and that the only contribution you could make to that process was to not add to them. There was also the question of her health, which he continued to track without discussing. The Tuesday morning appointments at the Denver Center for Neurological Research had become a fixture on the unofficial schedule. He had learned, through the structure of what she asked from him in the hours after each session, that they were physically demanding and produced results she did not yet feel ready to share, because the results came up in the particular edge of her focus in the afternoon that he had learned to read as concentration on something not in the room. He also noticed in the third week of November that on two separate occasions when she reached for the compass on a morning when the light was coming through the window at a direct angle, she paused before her hand found it. Not long. 2 seconds, perhaps 3. The pause of someone whose hand had moved toward a target whose position they had expected to perceive and had slightly perceived. He noted it. He said nothing. He placed the compass in exactly the same position the next morning, the one after, and every morning thereafter. The mid-story setback arrived on a Tuesday. It arrived in a form he had not precisely anticipated. Not a direct board challenge, but a legal mechanism, a petition for medical proxy authority over certain executive decisions, filed in the name of two board members whose names Owen knew from the materials he managed daily, and orchestrated by Arthur Renfield. He learned about it by accident. He was at his desk on a Tuesday morning when Nora's legal counsel, a woman named Farah Delacroix, called the main line rather than Nora's direct line and reached Owen instead. Delacroix had said, before realizing her error, that she needed to discuss the timeline on the Renfield matter. Owen had said, "I'll have her call you back." He had ended the call and sat for a moment with the phone in his hand. Then he had pulled the board filing records he had access to as part of his executive coordinator role and found, in the section he had not been given a reason to look at before today, the petition. It was dated 3 weeks ago. It had been filed quietly, routed through a compliance pathway that bypassed the normal board notification process. It cited 2 independent medical assessments, assessments Owen did not recognize from Nora's medical schedule, and argued that the CEO's functional impairment had reached a threshold requiring oversight of specific categories of decisions, including the Hartfield acquisition, pending the company's annual performance review. The language was careful and compassionate throughout. It read like something written by a person who believed it. Owen read it twice. Then he went to Nora's door and knocked. She said, "Come in." He came in and told her what had happened and what he had found. He told her without softening any of it, because softening it would have been a form of the management that was being used against her. He heard the quality of silence in the room change. She said, "When was it filed?" He said, 3 weeks ago. She said, "The timeline on the review." He said, "The annual performance review is in 41 days. She said, "Which gives Renfield 41 days to position the board before the review, and then use the review as the mechanism for the transition." He said, "Yes." She said, "Arthur." She said it quietly in the way you said the name of someone who had done something you had not believed they were capable of doing, even though part of you had known it was possible. Owen said nothing. She said, "Did he file it himself or through a proxy?" He said, "Through 2 board members, but the language is his. I know his writing style from the board correspondence." She said, "How do you know his writing style?" He said, "I've been managing your board communications for 3 months. You learn the patterns." She turned toward him, that particular orientation. She said, "What else have you noticed that you haven't told me?" He said, "The acquisition is being slowed by delays that I don't have authorization to review in full, but that are consistent with someone creating friction without obviously creating obstruction." Hartfield terms are good. They've been good for 4 months. The slowness is not financial. She said, "It's political." He said, "Yes." She sat for a long time with her hands on the desk. Her right hand moved slightly toward the compass. She stopped it. Then she picked the compass up and held it. She said, "Arthur Renfield was 32 years old when I walked into his office with a prototype and a business plan. He was the 3rd investor I had tried. The first 2 told me to come back when I was older. He told me he had been waiting for someone who understood what glass could do." Owen said nothing. She said, "He is doing this because he loves me, which makes it considerably harder than if he were doing it out of greed or ambition." Owen said, "Yes." She set the compass down. She said, "I need everything. Every document in the board filing system, every correspondence thread involving the petition, the names of the 2 board members who filed as proxies, and the full terms of whatever transition structure is implied. I need it on my system in a format I can navigate by tomorrow morning at 6. He said it'll be there at 5:30. She said, Owen. He stopped. She said, you found this by accident. He said, the call came to the wrong line. She said, but you knew to look. He said, I had noticed some things. She said, why didn't you tell me when you noticed them? He said, because I didn't have enough to show you yet. A feeling isn't evidence. You needed evidence. She was quiet. She said, most people tell me what they feel and call it information. He said, I know. She said, go pull the documents. Thank you. He pulled them. He worked until midnight in his home office while Piper slept in the next room, building the file structure Nora needed, cross-referencing the petition language against board correspondence, mapping the timeline of the acquisition delays against the petition's filing date, and preparing a summary brief that laid the architecture of the situation plainly. He sent it to her system at 5:19. Her read receipt came in at 5:24. The 2 days that followed were the most densely operational of the 3 months they had worked together, and they were also the days in which Owen understood, with the clarity that came from proximity to high stakes, what kind of person Nora Ashworth was when the difficulty was real rather than manufactured. Not that any of the previous 3 months had been manufactured. But there was a difference between the difficulty of running a company with a disability and the difficulty of having the people who were supposed to support that effort working against it. The first was the situation she was in. The second was a wound inside the situation, the kind that was harder because it came from someone who knew where to cut. She did not spend time on what it meant that Arthur Renfield had done this. Or rather, she spent exactly as much time as was necessary to understand it, and then she spent the rest of her time on what to do about it. He watched this happen in real time and recognized it from the inside, the deliberate channeling of a complicated feeling into the work that the situation required, because he had done the same thing for 3 years with a different complication. She moved fast. She moved with the efficiency of someone who had been trained by necessity to run her operations without the luxury of extended deliberation, because the world moved at the speed of people who could see it fully, and she had learned to keep up. He matched her pace, and in doing so learned something he had not quite known before, that the pace at which 2 people could work when they were genuinely aligned was different from the pace at which 2 people worked when one was leading and the other following. They were aligned. It was the right word, not because they had agreed to be, not because they had discussed it, but because the work pulled in a single direction and they were both pulling it. He built the document architecture. She navigated it by screen reader and voice command faster than he could have navigated it by eye, because the architecture was good and she knew her company and did not need to look for things she had not forgotten. He coordinated with the CFO and the Hartfield legal team, framing his requests in language that did not reveal the internal situation, which required a kind of care, being truthful about what he needed without being truthful about why. That was professionally difficult, and which he handled by asking for the information under the legitimate heading of the acquisition preparation that was, in fact, the primary purpose of the work. She prepared the verbal briefing structure for the board presentation with the same systematic attention she brought to everything, and he built the document to her specifications. And in the evenings after she dismissed him, he continued working from home, at the kitchen table after Piper was asleep, until his notes were complete and her system was ready for the next day's session. On the 4th evening of the sprint, he was still at his desk at 8 when she said, from behind the open door of her office, "Tell me something that isn't about the acquisition." He looked up. He said, "Piper is trying to learn chess. She watched a tutorial video and has been asking me to play with her every night. She's already beaten me twice." Nora said, "How?" He said, "She doesn't react to what I do. She thinks 3 moves ahead and plays toward a position she decided on before she started. I don't notice it's happening until it's already happened." Nora said, "Where does she get that?" He thought about it honestly. He said, "Her mother was like that. Strategic. You'd think she was doing one thing and she was doing something else entirely. Nora was quiet for a moment. She said, "Tell me about her." He said, "Marisol. She was a structural engineer. She specialized in adaptive retrofits buildings that needed to be modified to work differently than they were designed to work. She used to say that the best structures were the ones that could accept a new use without losing what made them themselves." Nora said, "Did she know you were going to do this kind of work?" He said, "She knew I'd end up doing something where the precision mattered more than the title. She said that about me early on, that I was someone who needed the work to be real." Nora said she was right. He said she was right about most things. She was right about Piper, that she'd be a force. She said that when Piper was 2. She said, "How long were you together?" He said, 6 years. "We were married for 3. She said, "In the bike path," he said, "Sunday morning. She went earlier than planned because the weather was better than expected. I was supposed to go with her, but the contractor call ran over. I told her I'd catch up. I didn't." He said it matter-of-factly, the way you said things you had said so many times in your own head that they had lost the power to undo you, even though the weight was still there. She said, "Owen." He said, "Yes." She said, "I told you about David because I wanted you to understand something, not about him, about what it costs when someone looks at the thing that happened to you and decides that it makes you less." He said, "Yes." She said, "You are not less for what happened on the bike path. I want to be clear about that." He held the statement for a moment. He understood what it had cost her to say it directly. He said, "Thank you." She said, "You're very good at receiving difficult things without making them into something larger than they are." He said, "I've had practice." She said, "I know. That's what makes you good at it." She went back to her work. He went back to his. Outside, Denver was doing its November thing, dark and dry and cold in the way that made the mountains look closer than they were, the snow on the peaks sharp against the night sky. He worked for another hour and then drove home through the cold, and Piper was already asleep, and he looked in on her and found her on her side with her sketchbook on the nightstand and a pencil still between 2 fingers that had gone slack. He freed the pencil carefully and set it beside the book and went to bed thinking about structural engineers who had known from early on what kind of person he was. The 2 days that followed were the most densely operational of the 3 months they had worked together. Nora moved through the situation with a quality Owen could only describe as cold precision, not coldness that came from not caring, but coldness in the mechanical sense, the absence of heat that made a machine run cleanly without friction from emotion. She called Farah Delacroix first. The call lasted 47 minutes. He heard Nora's voice from behind the closed door, not the words but the cadence, measured, accelerating at intervals, then returning to the measured baseline. When the call ended, she opened the door and said, "The proxy petition is procedurally flawed. The 2 board members who signed it did not follow the notification requirements in the governance charter. It can be challenged." He said, "Challenged how?" She said, "By calling a full board session within the 30-day window before the annual review. If I present the Hartfield acquisition terms myself, with full documentation and demonstrate operational continuity in real time, the petition fails for lack of supporting evidence." He said, "You have 31 days." She said, 30. He said, "What do you need?" She said, "I need the Hartfield acquisition package rebuilt from the current terms up. Every financial projection, every operational integration analysis, every contingency model. In a format I can present verbally with screen reader support and navigation assistance." He said, "How long does that usually take your team?" She said, 6 weeks minimum." He said, "All right." She said, "You understand that's not possible." He said, "I understand it's difficult." She said, "Owen." He said, "What do you need first?" They worked for 18 days with a focus that did not feel like urgency, though it was urgency, because urgency in the register he had learned from deployment was something you managed into steadiness rather than performing as speed. He built the document architecture. He coordinated with Ashworth Optics Group's CFO and the Hartfield legal team, framing the requests in language that did not reveal the internal situation. He prepared the verbal briefing structures that Nora would navigate during the board presentation, designing each section with clear decision points and summary statements that a screen reader could deliver with the clarity of a cited presenter's slides. He also, during those 18 days, learned something about Nora Ashworth that had not been in the Forbes profile, or the corporate filings, or the brief mentions in the business press. He learned it incrementally, the way you learned most things about a person when you spent 12 hours a day in close professional proximity to them and paid attention. He learned that she had started in the third week of October a new set of sessions with Dr. Alina Marsh that were distinct from the physical therapy appointments on her calendar. The new sessions were not on the calendar. He knew about them because he managed her driver schedule, and the driver had made 3 Tuesday morning trips to the Denver Center for Neurological Research that were not accounted for in the official schedule. He did not ask about them. He learned that she had been eating less than she should, not from distress, but from concentration, the kind of absorbed focus that was its own form of forgetting. He had started placing a small plate from the building's cafeteria on the edge of her desk at 1 o'clock without announcement, and she had started eating it without acknowledging that he had placed it there, which he understood as acceptance. He learned that she kept the drawing Piper had made on the windowsill regardless of the light conditions. On overcast days, when there was nothing to catch the color, it was still there in its place. He learned that the compass meant more than she had said it meant. She reached for it when she was working through a difficult problem, not as a gesture but as a grounding, the physical reality of it in her hand while everything else was navigated through other senses. He did not tell her any of this. He simply made room for it. On the 17th day of the 18-day sprint, something happened that was not in any plan. He had stayed late, it was past 9. Piper was at his mother's. The building had gone quiet around the 42nd floor. Nora was still at her desk. He was at his, reviewing the final section of the acquisition document for the third time, checking for anything the screen reader might navigate awkwardly. He heard her say from behind the open door, "Owen." He said, "Here." She said, "Come in for a moment." He came in. She was at her desk with her hands around a coffee cup that had been empty for some time, and she was turned toward the west window, toward the dark shape of the mountains against the city glow. She said, "Tell me what the mountains look like tonight." He looked at them. He said, "The snow line came down. You can see it on the foothills, white down to about the halfway point. The lights of the city make the bottom of the range orange. The peaks are dark against a sky that's not quite black, more dark blue. There's a crescent moon to the southwest." She was quiet. She said, "Piper said the mountains look like someone folded them." He said, "That's accurate." She said, "I used to look at them every morning. My office faces west on purpose. I designed the renovation so this window would be the first thing I saw when I came in." He said, "You still face them in the morning." She said, "It's not the same." He said, "No." She said, "Everyone tells me it will be the same, that I'll adjust and it will feel equivalent. My board, my staff, Arthur." He said, "Do you want me to tell you that?" She said, "No." He said, "Then I won't." She turned toward him in the darkness. The office lights were low, she preferred them low, they were irrelevant to her and he had long since stopped needing the overhead brightness. She said, "Why did you take this position?" He said, "I needed the work." She said, "That's what you told me in the interview. I mean, why did you stay? You're not the first person to need the work. Most of them left." He said, "Most of them treated the difficulty as something being done to them." She said, "And you?" He said, "I treated it as the environment." She said, "That's a military answer." He said, "It's the answer I have." She said, "Your wife. You said you were supposed to be with her that morning." He said, "Yes." She said, "Did you spend a long time thinking you should have been there?" It was not a question exactly. It was the voice of someone who understood the landscape. He said, 2 years, give or take." She said, "What ended it?" He said, "Piper started being afraid of bikes because of how it happened. And I had to help her not be afraid, which meant I had to stop treating the thing that happened as something I should have prevented and start treating it as something that happened. So she could learn to ride." She was quiet. She said, "She rides now?" He said, "She does. She's not afraid of it." She said, "You taught her that." He said, "We taught each other." The room held that. Outside, Denver did what Denver did at 9 on an October evening, moving and lit and entirely indifferent to what was happening 42 floors above its streets. She said, "I was in a relationship when the blindness began. His name was David. We had been together for 3 years. He stayed for 4 months after the diagnosis and left because, as he explained, He didn't know how to be with someone who was going to be diminished. The words sat in the air between them. Owen said, diminished. She said, his word. He said, what do you think about that word now? She said, I think people reveal themselves most clearly when they have the most to lose by revealing themselves. David revealed himself. Arthur is revealing himself. I'm apparently the kind of person who attracts people who believe they know what's best for me. She said it without self-pity, the way you state a persistent feature of your experience. Owen said, the board presentation will change the terms. She said, the board presentation is not the issue. He said, what is the issue? She said, the issue is that I have been running this company for 14 months without being able to see the faces of the people I'm asking to believe in it. And some days I do not know whether I am being courageous or deluded. And the only person who treats that question as something other than a crisis is a 7-year-old who draws stars on things that are hard to see. He said, what do I do? She said, nothing. I'm not asking you to solve it, I'm telling you because you asked. He said, I know. She said, that's new for me, people who know the difference. He said, is it useful? She said, yes. He said, then I'm glad. She turned back toward the window. She said, go home, the document is finished, you should sleep. He said, it's a good document. She said, it's an excellent document. You had 11 days less than should have been necessary. He said, good night, Nora. There was a pause. She said, good night, Owen. He got his jacket and his bag and rode the elevator down through the quiet building and drove home through the Denver dark. And he did not analyze what had happened in that conversation, because the important things in his experience resisted analysis and became something else when you tried to pin them in place. And he had learned the hard way that some things needed to be carried rather than examined until you understood them. The board presentation was on a Thursday. Owen had been in boardrooms before, in various capacities, and what struck him about this one was how completely Nora owned the room without being able to see it. She presented from the head of the table using the briefing structure they had built together. She navigated the acquisition documents by memory, and by the verbal cues Owen delivered from a position to her left, low enough that they registered as subtext rather than prompts, a word, a number, a name, when she reached for them. The CFO, who had been nervous about the format, had stopped looking nervous by the third minute. The Hartfield terms were good. They had always been good. Presented in Nora's voice, with the full weight of her understanding behind them, they were unmistakably excellent. Arthur Renfield sat to her right. He said nothing during the presentation. Owen watched him through the body of it. A man in the experience of watching something he had decided was impossible prove itself possible, and not quite knowing what to do with the evidence. When the presentation ended, the board discussion took 40 minutes. The proxy petition was not formally raised. It did not need to be. The weight of the room had shifted. Marcus Chen, who was the lead independent director and the board member Owen had calculated was the key vote, asked 2 specific questions about the acquisition's integration timeline. Nora answered both with a precision that made the CFO, to Owen's left, exhale almost inaudibly. The vote to proceed with the Hartfield acquisition passed 6-1. Renfield's vote was the one. He abstained, not voted against. Owen had not anticipated the abstention. He thought about it for a moment and decided it meant something different from a no. It meant a man who was not ready to admit he had been wrong but was not willing to extend the wrong further. When the board session ended and the room had cleared to the 4-person executive group, Renfield approached Nora. He stood beside her for a moment without speaking. Then he said, in a voice that had lost its usual authority, Nora, I need to explain. She said, Arthur. He said, I was watching you struggle and I couldn't fix it. I thought if I could protect you from the board, from the scrutiny, from having to prove yourself every quarter I could, she said, you could take the decision away from me. He said, I thought I was being kind. She said, I know you did. He said, was I wrong? She said, yes. He said, I'm sorry. She reached across the table and her hand found his arm, not accidentally. She knew where he was standing. She had tracked the movement and the sound. She held his forearm for a moment. She said, you gave me the compass to use, not to have used for me. The silence was the kind that held many years of relationship inside it. He said, the petition is withdrawn as of today. She said, thank you. He said, the acquisition is good, it's a good deal. She said, I know, I built it. Renfield left. The room held Owen and Nora and the thin Denver autumn light coming through the boardroom windows. She said, "What was his expression during the vote?" Owen said he looked like someone watching a calculation come out differently than he expected. She said, "The abstention." He said, "Yes." She said, "He'll come back around." He said, "I think so." She said he was afraid, not of the company failing, of watching me fail while he stood by. He has a daughter with a progressive illness. He's been watching her fight for years. Owen had not known this. He said, "How did you know?" She said, "His assistant mentioned it once in passing 3 years ago. He never brought it up himself. I've been thinking about it since Tuesday." Owen said he saw himself. She said, "And assumed I would follow the same arc." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Owen, the sessions with Dr. Marsh. The Tuesday mornings." He said, "I noticed you weren't on the calendar." She said, "I've been seeing a specialist in optic nerve regeneration. Elena Marsh's referral. There is a treatment protocol that she has been cautiously testing on my condition. The results so far are incomplete but not negative." He said, "How not negative?" She said, "There have been 2 sessions in which I detected color distinction that was not present in the previous baseline. Red and yellow, not clearly, as if someone turned a lamp on in a room that had been dark." He said, "When did this start?" She said, 8 weeks ago." He said, "Before the board situation escalated." She said, "Yes." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She said, "Because I did not want to tell anyone while it might still be nothing. I have been told good news before. I have learned that good news is a loan." He said, "Yes." She said, "You know that feeling?" He said, "I do." She said, "I'm telling you now because you have earned the right to know things that are still uncertain." He held that for a moment. The particular weight of trust offered in the form of an incomplete truth. He said, "What does Dr. Marsh say about the timeline?" She said, "She says it's early. She says the optic nerve is not like bone. It does not heal on a schedule. She says that what she has seen in 8 weeks is more than she expected to see in 6 months, and she has been careful to tell me not to build on that expectation, and I have been careful to listen to her." He said, "What do you want?" She said, "I want to see the mountains. Simple. Unadorned." He said, "All right." She said, "That's an odd thing to say to that." He said, "I mean it. All right. Whatever it takes." She turned toward him. In the boardroom light she looked tired in a way she did not let herself look in the office, the particular tiredness of a person who has been holding everything together for a long time and has just been given permission to sit down. She said, "Your daughter?" He said, "Yes." She said, "Can she come this afternoon? After the session I have at 3. I'd like to thank her." He said, "For the drawing." She said, "For the star. For what she said about things that are hard to see." He called his mother. Piper came at 4. Piper came into the office with her sketchbook under her arm and stood in the doorway with her particular combination of directness and care, looking at Nora, then at the windowsill where her drawing still sat. She said, "You kept it." Nora said, "I did." Piper said, "I can make more if you want. I drew the mountains again yesterday when the snow came further down." Nora said, "I'd like that." Piper sat cross-legged on the floor near the west window. Owen watched her calculate where the light was coming from and position herself to tell Nora about it from the correct direction, and opened her sketchbook and began drawing. After a moment she said, "The snow is all the way to the city edge today. It looks like it's trying to come inside." Nora turned toward the window. She said, "What color is it?" Piper said, "The snow is blue in the shade parts and bright yellow-white where the sun hits. The mountains behind it are gray and purple. The sky is really blue, the kind of blue that looks like it means something." Nora said, "What does it mean?" Piper said, "It means it's going to be cold tonight but clear. My dad says that's the best kind." Nora said, "He's right about that." Piper drew for 20 minutes in the quiet of the office. Then she came to the desk and placed the drawing in its usual spot, the edge of the desk, at the reach of Nora's hand. She said, "I put the star again. Different place this time, on the mountain instead of the building." Nora reached for the drawing. Her hand found it. She said, "What made you put it on the mountain?" Piper said, "Because the mountain is still there even when you can't see it. I thought that was like a star." Nora held the drawing. She said, "Piper." Piper said, "Yeah." She said, "I'm going to tell you something and I'd like you to keep it between us for now because it might change and I don't want to tell everyone yet." Piper said, "Okay." Nora said, "There is a possibility that some of my sight may come back. I've been doing a treatment and it's showing some early signs. I can see some colors that I couldn't see before." Piper said, which colors? Nora said, red and yellow. Piper thought about this with the concentrated seriousness she applied to important things. She said, so you can't see blue yet? Nora said, not yet. Piper said, that's okay. I'll keep drawing the blue parts until you can. Nora looked at Owen. Owen said nothing. He was looking at the window. The mountains were exactly where they always were, gray and purple and there. After Piper had gone back to her grandmother's, with a promise to bring more drawings, Owen stayed to complete the end-of-day briefing. The office had a different quality in these early evening hours, the light going low, Denver past the windows moving into its evening mode, the building's ambient sound subsiding to something quieter and more particular. He was at his desk when Nora said, from behind her door, Owen. He said, here. She said, come in. He came in. She was at her desk with her hands around the coffee cup, the one that had been empty since early afternoon, and she was turned toward the window the way she had been turned toward it that night in October when she had asked him to describe the mountains. The same quality of attention, the same stillness. She said, when Piper said she would keep drawing the blue parts until I could see them. He waited. She said she assumed I would see them eventually. He said yes. She said not as a hope. As a fact, he said, Piper treats things as facts until they prove otherwise. Nora said most adults don't do that. He said most adults have had enough time to accumulate evidence for the other approach. She said that's true. She held the cup. She said, I need to tell you about the Tuesday appointments. He said, you don't have to. She said, I know. I'm choosing to. She set the cup down. She said, 3 months ago, Dr. Marsh referred me to a colleague at the Denver Center for Neurological Research. Her name is Dr. Irene Voss. She specializes in optic nerve regeneration therapies that are still in late-stage clinical development, approaches that haven't been widely adopted yet because the protocols are complex and the results are inconsistent. Marsh thought I might be a candidate based on the imaging she'd done over the previous 8 months. She said the therapy involves electrical stimulation of specific nerve pathways in combination with targeted neurotrophic treatments. It's uncomfortable. The sessions run 3 hours on Tuesdays, and I come in afterward and work because working is how I manage the kind of exhaustion that is not physical. He said, I know. I adjusted your calendar accordingly. She turned toward him. He had become accustomed to what that meant. The weight of her attention directed at him without the signal of eye contact that most people used as shorthand for it, and he had come to find the directness of her other attention, posture, voice, orientation, more precise than most eye contact he received. She said, the third session showed something Voss had not anticipated, a measurable change in the pathway response on the right side. Not large, not clinically significant in the way she uses that term, but real. He said, what kind of change? She said she described it as a reactivation of a pathway that had been functionally dormant. She said it was possible the optic nerve had been not damaged but suppressed, that the progressive nature of the condition had triggered a protective response in the nervous system that had essentially shut down the pathway rather than destroying it. She said this was a theoretical model, not a confirmed diagnosis, and that the change she had seen in session 3 might not persist. He said, did it persist? She said, the session this past Tuesday, it persisted. The response was stronger. He said nothing. She said she has not told me to hope for anything specific. She has been careful about that. She has told me that the treatment will continue and that the data will tell her more in the next 2 months than it can tell her now. He said, what color is it? When you perceive the color, I mean. She said, warm. Both of them are warm colors, red and yellow. As if someone turned on a lamp in a room that had been dark. He said, Piper said the warm parts are where she presses hardest when she draws for you. Nora was quiet. She said, I know. I could tell. He said she figured that out herself. I didn't tell her. She said, I know that too. She's 7 and she understands things that most adults spend their whole lives not understanding. He said she had good teachers. She said, you and Marisol. He said, Marisol more than me. She said, that's not what I observe. He stayed with that. She said, Owen. I am telling you this because you have been placing that compass in the same position every morning for 3 months, and because you described the mountains at night without my asking, and because when Piper put the drawing on the edge of the desk in the place where my hand would find it, you watched her do it and did not tell her that was exactly the right place. He said she knew where the right place was. She said yes, because she watches. She watches the way you watch. She learned it from you. He said nothing. She said the treatment may not produce functional vision. Voss has been very clear about that. The pathway change may plateau at color distinction and edge detection and not progress further. I have been telling myself this every Tuesday for 3 months so that I don't build something on uncertain ground. He said, and she said, and Piper drew a star on the mountain and said things that are hard to see are still there. And I have been trying to tell myself that it does not mean what my instinct says it means, which is that the ground is less uncertain than I have been treating it. He said, what does Voss say? She said, she says she has seen patients with similar presentation recover to functional vision with correction. She has seen patients plateau. She does not know yet which I am. She says the rate of change in the past 6 weeks is faster than the protocol predicts. He said, what do you do with that? She said, I work. I finish the board presentation. I close the acquisition. I come in every morning and put my hand on the compass and orient myself and do the next thing. He said, and on Tuesday morning. She said, I go to the Denver Center for Neurological Research and let them run the protocol, and I do not build anything on the results until Voss tells me the ground is real. He said, that sounds like the right approach. She said, it sounds like what I am capable of right now. He said, that's the same thing. She turned toward the window again. He said, Piper is going to bring you more drawings. She has a project. She's been tracking the snowline through the autumn, drawing it each Friday. The mountains in different lights, different weathers. She labels them in the lower corner with the date and what she noticed. Nora said, what has she noticed? He said, that the light changes faster than the snow, that the shadows on the east face are always bluer than the shadows on the west face even when there's no color reason for it, because of how the sky reflects, that there's a peak that looks like someone sat on it, slightly flattened at the top, that she says looks different in rain versus sun. Nora said, which peak? He said, I'll ask her. She'll know. She said, yes. The acquisition build had 3 weeks left. They worked through it with the particular efficiency of 2 people who had stopped wasting time on navigation and could put all of it into the work. He had begun to understand in those 3 weeks the full scope of what she had built. He had been inside the operations of Ashworth Optics Group for nearly 4 months, and he had built his picture of it piece by piece. The way the documents accumulated into a company, the way the company's history accumulated in the structure of its decisions, the bets she had made and the bets that had paid, and the 2 years in the middle when they hadn't and she had restructured and kept going. One evening, near the end of the sprint, he said without planning to, you know what this company is? She said, what do you mean? He said, most companies in this space are technology companies that make optics. You built an optics company that is also a technology company. The distinction is in how you handle the relationships with the end users. You know what glass can do that the engineers on the other end don't know it can do, and you've structured the company so that knowledge moves both directions. That's why the medical device contracts renew. That's why the defense contractors keep adding scope. You're not selling them components. You're teaching them what's possible. She was very still. She said, Elliot said that before I founded the company. He said, you know what glass can do that the people who use it don't know yet? That knowledge is the company. Everything else is how you deliver it. He said he was right. She said he died before I had anything to show him. He said you've been showing him. The room held that. Outside, Denver was doing what it did in the long stretch of winter dark, moving and bright and entirely indifferent. She said, Owen. He said, yes. She said, when this is over, when the board presentation is done and the acquisition is closed, I would like to take you somewhere. He said, where? She said, I want to go to Rocky Mountain National Park. I have not been since before the diagnosis. I used to go every autumn. There is a path along the creek that has a point where the mountains are unobstructed and the light is direct. He said, yes. She said, Piper should come. He said, she'll say yes before I finish asking. She said, good. She turned back to her work. He turned back to his. After Piper had gone back to her grandmother's with a promise to bring more drawings, Owen stayed to complete the end-of-day briefing. The office had the quality it sometimes had in the late afternoon, a particular quality of light and quiet that made the space feel different from its working hours self. Less a staging ground and more a room where things actually happened. He said, "The briefing today is short. The Hartfield vote passed. Renfield's petition is withdrawn. The only action item is a call with Farah Delacroix tomorrow to formally close the proxy matter." She said, "I know." He said, "Then that's the briefing." She said, "Owen." He said, "Yes." She said, "What do you want?" He said, "I don't understand the question." She said, "Yes, you do." He said, "I want Piper to be all right. I want to keep doing work that matters. I want things to stop being taken from people who have done nothing to deserve the taking." She said, "Those are not small things." He said, "No." She said, "What do you want from this, from here?" He heard the weight in the question. He knew what she was asking and he answered it honestly, the way he had learned to answer her. He said, "I want to stay. I want to be the person in the room who does what needs to be done. I want to go on placing the compass in the same place every morning. I want to hear Piper tell you the color of the mountains until you can see them yourself." She was quiet. She said, "That's a very specific want." He said, "I'm a specific person." She said, "David told me I would be diminished." He said, "I know." She said, "You have never treated me as diminished." He said, "No." She said, "I don't know how to do this. I'm not unaware of what is happening here, but I don't know how to do it. Every person I have trusted has eventually decided that their idea of what was best for me was more reliable than my own." He said, "I know that." She said, "How do I know you won't do the same?" He said, "You don't." He said, "I can tell you that I've never replaced a decision of yours with my own judgment unless you ask me to. I can tell you that I've had opportunities to take the easy path to manage you, to protect you in ways that would have felt like care and would have been control, and I didn't take them. I can tell you that Piper trusts you, and Piper doesn't trust people without reading them correctly." He said, "But knowing and trusting are different things, and you'll have to decide whether to trust based on the evidence you have, not on what I tell you." She said, "The evidence I have is 8 weeks of someone who got up every morning and placed a compass in the same spot and told me what the mountains looked like at night." He said, "Yes." She said, "That's what you think love looks like." He said, "I think that's what it starts looking like." She reached across the desk. Her hand moved with the sureness of someone navigating a space they knew completely. It found his forearm. She held it the way she had held Renfield's, except this was different in a way that had no analogy in the vocabulary of professional relationships. She said, "I'm afraid." He said, "I know." She said, "Of trying again and finding out I was wrong about someone." He said, "That's a reasonable thing to be afraid of." She said, "Aren't you afraid?" He said, "I'm afraid every day. That's not new information. What's new is being afraid of something worth being afraid of." She held his arm. Outside the office, Denver was going dark in the way it went dark in late autumn, quickly and cleanly, the mountains disappearing into the night sky, the lights of the city coming up, the whole ordinary, unremarkable, beautiful fact of another day ending. She said, "Piper said the buildings are taller than they look from the outside." He said, "She said that." She said, "Her first time here. She looked at the building from the street before she came up and she said it was taller from inside. I heard her tell Gretchen on her way to the elevator." He said, "She's right." She said, "Yes." She held his arm for another moment. Then she said, "Will you be here tomorrow morning?" He said, "I'll be here at 5:45. She said, "The compass." He said, "The same place it always is." She said, "Good." She let go. She turned back toward her work. He gathered his things in the way he had gathered them every evening for 3 months, the end-of-day ritual of a person who had learned what it meant to close a day properly. He checked the compass was positioned correctly for morning. He checked that the drawing on the windowsill was angled where the first light would find it. He said, "Good night, Nora." She said, "Good night, Owen." He rode the elevator down through the quiet building and drove home through the Denver dark. And this time he let himself think about what had happened in that office, not to analyze it into pieces but just to hold it, the feeling of a thing that had been earned rather than found, built rather than discovered, which was a different quality of feeling, and one he had not had in 3 years. Piper was asleep when he got home. He looked in on her. She was on her side with one arm out, her sketchbook on the nightstand, a pencil still between 2 fingers that had gone slack in sleep. He gently freed the pencil. He set it on the nightstand beside the sketchbook. He went to bed. The weeks that followed had the quality of a road after a pass has been cleared. Not easy, but navigable, the worst obstacles acknowledged and no longer hidden. In the week between the board presentation and the acquisition close, there was a different kind of work to do. Not operational, not strategic. The operational and strategic machinery was running on its own momentum now, carried forward by agreements that had already been made and documents that had already been signed. The week had a different texture, the particular texture of aftermath, of two people who had been in a sustained emergency together, and were now standing in the space the emergency had vacated. Owen was at his desk on a Wednesday morning when Nora said, without preceding context, "I've been thinking about what you said, about the company." He said, "Which part?" She said, "The part about what I know that the people who use the glass don't know yet, and about how the knowledge moves in both directions." He said, "Yes." She said, "There is something the company could do that it doesn't do yet, a product line, or rather not a product line, a service, a consulting architecture. Ashworth has the deepest applied optics knowledge of any company in this space, and we primarily sell that knowledge embedded in components. But there are institutions that need the knowledge before they know what component to ask for." He said, "Who?" She said, "Rehabilitation technology developers, medical imaging startups, adaptive interface designers, people who are building things for people whose relationship with visual information is not standard. They don't know what's optically possible for the applications they're designing because they come from software and electronics backgrounds and glass is a black box to them." Owen said, "You would be teaching them what glass can do." She said, "The way Elliot taught me." She said, "There would need to be a structure for it, a consulting model with a deliverable, a way to price it that reflects the value without creating a competitor from someone we've educated too well." He said, "What do you want me to do with this?" Said, "I want you to build me a first draft of what the model could look like. Not a business plan, a sketch. What it would take to offer this as a service, what the delivery structure would look like, what a pilot client might need." He said, "I can have something to you by Friday." She said, "Thursday." He said, "Thursday." He worked on it Wednesday evening and Thursday morning and had it on her system by 9. She read it and came out of her office at 10 and said, "The pricing architecture is conservative." He said, "I erred toward sustainable." She said, "You erred toward afraid." She was not unkind about it, she was precise. She said, "The value to a rehabilitation tech developer of knowing what is optically achievable before they build their system is not a consulting fee. It's the difference between a product that works and one that doesn't. Price it at the difference." He said, "That's a significant number." She said, "It's an accurate number." He said, "I'll revise it." She said, "I already revised it. I added a sliding scale for early-stage companies with equity upside built into the structure. I left your delivery model intact. The structure is good." He looked at her. She said, "You were a soldier and a logistics coordinator before this. You've learned executive operations in 4 months. The instinct for delivery structure is strong. The instinct for valuing your own contribution is still learning." He said, "Yes." She said, "Work on it." He said, "Noted." She went back into her office. He sat with the exchange for a moment, the particular quality of being seen clearly by someone who did not look at you with eyes but had been paying attention in all the other ways, and who was precise enough in what she observed to describe it back to you without flattery and without cruelty, just as the thing it was. He went back to his work. The weeks that followed had the quality of a road after a pass has been cleared. Not easy, but navigable, the worst obstacles acknowledged and no longer hidden. The Hartfield acquisition closed in 61 days. It was the largest deal in Ashworth Optics Group's history, and the integration required a level of sustained operational coordination that would have challenged any executive team. Owen managed the logistics, coordinated the working groups, and tracked the decision threads across time zones without losing a single thread, and Nora ran the substance of it with a precision that the Hartfield team, which had not known what to expect from a CEO with a significant visual impairment, had not anticipated, and then had no choice but to respect. Marcus Chen, at the first post-acquisition board dinner, said to Owen without knowing Owen would repeat it, "I've worked with a lot of executive teams. I've never seen someone run a deal like that. Owen said, she designed it. Chen said, I know. That's what I mean. Arthur Renfield attended the board dinner and sat across from Nora at the table. They spoke for 40 minutes on a subject Owen could not hear and did not try to hear. At the end of the evening, Renfield and Nora stood near the exit and Renfield said something, and Nora said something, and Renfield's face did the thing it had done at the abstention, a man recalculating, finding an answer that surprised him. Afterward, Nora said to Owen in the car, he told me about his daughter. Owen said her illness. He said she had stopped trying 3 years ago. He said watching her stop was the hardest thing he had seen in his life. He said when the blindness came, he was so afraid of watching me stop that he decided to stop me before I could. Owen said he was trying to protect you from his own experience. She said yes. He said he understood now that it was wrong. He said she would have wanted to try. Owen said, will you forgive him? She said, I already have. Understanding why someone does a thing is not the same as agreeing with it, but it is the beginning of forgiving it. She was quiet for a moment. She said, he reminded me of something. He said my mentor, the man who gave me the compass before him, a man named Elliot Cross who died before the company existed, used to say, the trouble with people who love you is that their fear looks exactly like your fear, and you have to keep looking at the compass to tell them apart. Owen said, who was he? She said, a physicist. He taught me optics. He died of cancer when I was 30. He was the person who taught me that glass was not passive, that it could be designed to change the way light behaved, not block it but redirect it. He said that was the whole of science, finding what redirects the light. Owen said, is that what you've been doing? She said, for 14 months, yes. The treatment with Dr. Alina Marsh proceeded with the patience of a process that had no schedule, only a direction. Owen learned about it in increments because Nora told him in increments, the way you tell someone about something important when you are learning yourself how important it is. The red and yellow had stabilized at a consistent, low level of distinction by the end of November. In December, during a session that Nora described to Owen the same evening, there had been a moment brief, not consistent, not repeatable yet, when she had looked toward the window and seen the edge of a shape against the light. Not clearly, not in a way she could describe except as a boundary, the boundary between the window frame and the sky beyond it. She had told Dr. Marsh. Dr. Marsh had been very still for a moment in the way of a specialist who has trained themselves not to react to preliminary data and is currently working against that training. She had said, tell me exactly what you saw. And Nora had told her. And Marsh had said, I need you to come in twice this week. Piper had begun bringing drawings every Friday, which had become the day Owen brought her to the office after school. She drew from the west window, the mountains in different lights, different weathers, different moments. She had developed a series of drawings that tracked the snowline through the autumn and into early winter, each one a precise record of where the white had reached on a given Friday afternoon. She had started labeling them in the lower corner, date, time, and what she had noticed. Nora, who could not see the drawings, could hold them. She could tell the texture of the pencil pressure, the lightness or heaviness of different sections. Piper had begun drawing more heavily in sections of brightness, the lit faces of rocks, the sun on the snow, so that Nora could feel where the light was. She had not told Piper to do this. Piper had worked it out herself. One Friday in December, Piper said without preamble, Owen says you might be able to see some colors. Nora said a few. Piper said which ones. Nora said red, yellow, possibly orange, but that might be both of the first two. Piper said, I'll start using more of those, but I'll keep doing the heavy parts for the light in case the other colors take a while. Nora said, that's thoughtful. Piper said, it's just practical. She said it with such precise simplicity that Owen had to look at the wall. The day Nora told him the full scope of what Dr. Marsh had found was a Tuesday in January. She asked him to come in. He sat across from her desk. She had the compass in her hand. She said the imaging that Marsh ran last week. She called me this morning with the full results. He waited. She said, there is measurable regeneration in the optic nerve pathways on both sides. It is incomplete. It is not guaranteed to continue. What she has seen in 3 months is more than the protocol predicted in 12. She does not know why. She says some nervous systems respond in ways that the science is still learning to predict. He said, what does it mean? She said, it means that the possibility of partial vision restoration is no longer theoretical. It is on a timeline, not a clear timeline, not a certain timeline, but a real one. He said, how partial? She said she doesn't know. She said she has seen patients with similar presentation recover to functional vision with corrective lenses. She has seen patients with similar presentation plateau at color distinction and edge detection. She does not know which I am yet. He said, what do you want? She said, I want to see the mountains. She said it the same way she had said it in the boardroom, simple, unadorned. He said, then we work toward that. She said, we? He said, yes. She put the compass down. She said, Owen. He said, yes. She said, Piper asked me something last week. I've been thinking about it. He said, what did she ask? She said, she asked me if I was going to be her dad's person. He said, what did you tell her? She said, I told her I was working on it. He said, what did she say to that? She said, okay. She said she had drawn a picture of all three of us at the mountains in case we ever went together and I could see it. Owen said nothing for a moment. He said, did she show it to you? She said, she left it on the desk. I've been holding it for 5 days. He said, what does it look like? She said, I don't know. I can feel where the pencil was heavy. 3 figures in the foreground, mountains behind. A star in the corner. He said, there's always a star. She said, yes. She held the drawing. He said, can I tell you what it looks like? She said, yes. He described it. The 3 figures, himself and Piper close together, Nora a step ahead, all 3 facing the mountains. The mountains rendered in Piper's particular way, folded looking real. The star in the upper corner where the sky met the first peak. He said, in the drawing you have your hand out. Your left hand held back slightly. Like you're about to take someone's. Nora said nothing. He said, I think that's what she meant. She said, yes. She reached across the desk. Her hand found his the way it had found Renfield's, the way it had found his forearm in October, except now it did not release. He held her hand. Outside, January Denver was doing what Denver did in January. The mountains visible in the cold, clear air, sharper than at any other time of year, the snow down to the foothills, the sky the particular blue that meant cold and clear and you could see everything. He said, I'm going to tell you what the mountains look like. She said, tell me. He said, they're white from the tree line to the peaks. The trees below the snow are dark green, almost black against the white. The sky behind the highest peak is a blue that's almost purple at the edge. The sun is at a low angle and it makes the snow on the west faces gold. The east faces are in shadow and they're that blue-gray that Piper draws more heavily because it's where the light isn't. She listened. She said, what does the gold look like? He said, it looks like the light remembers where it came from. She said, that's a strange thing to say. He said, it's what I see. She held his hand and listened to him describe the mountains and the light on the mountains. And outside Denver moved in its ordinary way, enormous and indifferent and real. The acquisition closed. The board reshuffled. Renfield stepped back from the chair position in a handover that he and Nora designed together over 2 weeks of the kind of conversation that was possible between 2 people who had both acknowledged what they had done wrong and could now work forward from honesty. Marcus Chen took the chair. Dr. Marsh's treatment protocol continued. The imaging in February showed continued regeneration. The boundary detection that had first appeared in December, the window frame against the sky, became consistent. By March, Nora could distinguish the shape of large objects in bright light. The window frame, the door, the rectangle of her desk. Not clearly. As if, she told Owen, someone was describing the room to her in broad strokes that she was filling in from memory. She said, I know where the compass is because I know where the compass is. But I can also see something at that location now. A shape, a brightness. He said, is it the compass? She said, it's something. She said it the way you said something when you did not want to claim more than you could support and also wanted very much to claim it. In April, on a Saturday, Owen drove them himself, Piper and Nora, to Rocky Mountain National Park. He had asked Nora 3 weeks earlier. She had said yes without hesitation, which in his experience of her meant the decision had been made long before he asked. They parked at the lower lot and walked the accessible path along the creek, Owen beside Nora, Piper ranging ahead and returning with reports. A bird she could not identify, an ice formation on the creek bank, the way the light came through a gap in the aspens and made a bright column on the snow. Nora walked with her hand in Owen's and her face turned toward the peaks when the trees opened enough to see them. At the clearest point on the path, where the mountains were unobstructed and the light was direct and the peaks rose white and enormous against the April sky, Nora stopped. Owen stopped with her. Piper, sensing without being told, came back and stood on Nora's other side. Nora stood with her face toward the mountains. She said, "I can see," and then she stopped. She said, "There is something." Owen said, "What do you see?" She said, "A brightness, of the shape of something very large against the light, the difference between the sky and there's an edge." She said, "There's an edge, Owen." He said, "Yes." She said, "The mountains." He said, "The mountains." She stood with her face toward the Rockies and something moved through her expression that was not the trained containment of someone managing a great deal without showing it on the surface. It was the face underneath that one, the face that had been there for 38 years, before the Forbes profile and the boardroom, and the 14 months of navigating by memory and sound, and the exact position of a compass on a desk. Piper took her other hand. Nora stood between the two of them, between the father and the daughter who had stayed when staying was difficult, who had placed a compass in the same spot every morning and drawn stars on things that were hard to see. She said, "I told you I wanted to see the mountains." Owen said, "I know." She said, "This is seeing the mountains." He said, "Yes." She held both their hands and the mountains stood where they had always stood, white and enormous and entirely indifferent to what was happening at the base of them and entirely present. There is a version of a story about a blind CEO and a single father that organizes itself around rescue. The man who came to save the woman in her diminishment, the woman who opened a door to let him in. That version is simpler. It has a clear direction of grace. It resolves cleanly. That is not what happened. What happened was two people, both of them carrying losses they had not finished carrying, who ended up in the same room because one needed the work and one had run out of people willing to do it, and who discovered slowly and through proximity and sustained attention that the other person was not what they had been prepared for. Nora Ashworth was not diminished. She had been told she was diminished. She had been treated as someone whose best self was behind her. She had absorbed enough of that narrative to start wondering if it was accurate, which was the most dangerous part of it. Not the external pressure, but the internal one. The moment when you cannot tell anymore whether you are fighting reality or your own fear. Owen Callard was not a rescuer. He had not come to save anyone. He had come because his daughter needed school shoes, and his truck needed 2 new tires, and the check engine light had been on since winter. He had stayed because the work mattered, and because the person he was doing it for was worth the difficulty, and because somewhere in the 3rd month, the reason he came and the reason he stayed had become the same reason. What he gave her was not rescue. It was refusal. The refusal to treat her blindness as the most interesting thing about her. The refusal to step into the space that David and Arthur and the corporate system around her had been building, the space that said, she needs to be managed, protected, decided for. The refusal to do any of that every single day, in the ordinary form of a compass placed in the same position, and a mountain described in the dark, and a plate of food set at the edge of a desk. Showing up is not a small thing when showing up is the thing that every other person has stopped doing. What Nora gave Owen was the thing he had not known he was missing and could not have named before she gave it. She gave him work that required the whole of him, not just the logistical competence, the organizational efficiency, the steady under-pressure quality that his deployment years had built, but the part that noticed what was not being said and cared about what the said and unsaid meant. She gave him a place to be both excellent and present, which he had not had since Marisol and had stopped expecting to have. She also gave him this, the proof that the thing he had taught Piper about the bike path was true, that the accident was a thing that had happened, that the what-ifs, the "I should have been there," the 41 days he had run through in his head in the parking lot at the hospital while a stranger drove him because he could not drive, that none of those were the story. The story was what came after. Piper had drawn 3 of them at the mountains before she had any evidence they would go there. She had put a star in the corner because she knew what her father had taught her. Things that are hard to see are still there. She had been right. The compass is still on the desk. In the mornings, before Nora arrives, Owen places it in its exact position, to the right of the keyboard where her hand rests naturally. He has done this every working day for 9 months. He expects to keep doing it. Not because she still needs it to navigate in the same way. She can see the desk now, the broad shapes of it, the window behind it, the mountains beyond, but because it is how a day should start, with something reliable in its place. Piper's drawings are on the windowsill. 7 of them, the series of the snowline through the autumn and winter. The mountains in different lights. The one she drew in February that shows the 3 of them facing the peaks. The star in all of them. On the most recent drawing, Piper wrote in the lower corner in her careful labeling, March, afternoon, mountains, all present. That is the true thing. Not what anyone recovered or won or achieved. Not the acquisition or the board vote or the treatment protocol or the vision that was returning in increments that no specialist had predicted, and that Nora received with the same careful refusal to build on uncertain ground until the ground was real. The true thing is smaller and more durable than any of that. It is a man who got up every morning and placed a compass in the same spot. It is a 7-year-old who drew stars on things that were hard to see. It is a woman who had been told she was finished and refused, quietly and completely, to be finished. They showed up. All 3 of them for different reasons in different ways with different capacities. That was the whole of it. That was enough.